Hi everyone, I am Mark Seifter, the Director of Game Design here at Roll for Combat, and with me is Derik Malenda from Knights of Last Call, and we are here to talk to you today about whether you can play D&D and the very D&D-like games such as Pathfinder without any combat at all, and whether that is a good idea.
Yes, no.
Okay, you got it, you guys. You could actually possibly leave if you don't care about the why or the how to either of those questions, because Derik and I both agree that the answer is yes and no. Although I would say yes and probably not, or
Yeah.
maybe like almost definitely yes and
Yeah.
probably not, because there are a few situations where you would want to play Dungeons and Dragons without any combat. And there may be some groups that can't play Dungeons and Dragons without any combat.
Sure. Well, really, the biggest thing that it comes down to is, for me, and again, it varies from group to group. It varies from person to person. But my personal philosophy is that, I would never say that, oh, you look at a game like D&D, it has all these rules for combat, and that means you have to spend a lot of time in combat. I don't think that's true. However, the game does have a lot of rules for combat, and there's a lot of class features that are centered around combat. There's a lot of feats and skill type actions that are centered around combat. And so, if you're not gonna fight, or you're gonna fight very rarely, why did you choose a game that has so much content and so much rules and so much baggage that is tied and related to that thing? It's like if you needed a small car to commute you back and forth, but to get downtown to your job, why did you buy the extended cab F350? Are you hauling anything? Are you planning on? Do you have a trailer? Are you hauling manure? Are you hauling wood? No. Then why'd you buy an F350? Why are you putting up with all the extra hassle of that big, huge, massive truck when you could just get a nice, light, efficient vehicle? And so, for my general philosophy is that, and by the way, there are people who do go and buy a big truck and they commute to work with it. I think it's silly, but they want to have that in their back pocket just in case, I guess. In which case, okay.
Well, that is one of the answers that I came up with, because I realized that even without talking to you in advance that we were going to get to this point of like, why would you even do that? And I think there's a few reasons, one of which is kind of like the having the truck in their back pocket situation. That's even a reason that Brennan Lee Mulligan gave to an interviewer who asked, given that you like heavy role play in your game and like acting and other things more than combat, why do you choose D&D? And he said, because I'm good at those other things, I can do them without a game, and I want the game to sort of be there standing behind me in my corner for the parts that I'm not good at, just in case, and for when they do come up. So it's kind of like the idea of, in diplomacy, speaking softly and carrying a big stick. The big stick, the threat of violence, is the threat of the D&D combat system, or the Pathfinder combat system, or whatever, a system that is sort of more well-defined for those few times that your combat would break out in a game that doesn't expect to have combat. That's one reason why some groups make this decision.
It's funny how people's perspectives are so different, because on one hand, you have someone like what you were referring to, or you have like the Bleems, right? The Brennan Lee Mulligans. I would make sure I call him Bleem, because if you call him BLM, it can be a little confusing.
Yeah.
So, but anyways, so you have the folks who Bleem say, I'm not good at this part of the game, so I want a detailed, or not good at this part of the game, I guess is.
But he was just saying that like he wasn't inherently on his own without a game.
Yeah.
Super strong in that compared to how he was in everything else. That was his response.
And it's interesting how someone like him and some other people say, and that's why I want a detailed set of structural, procedural, even combat rules. But then the entire philosophy of the OSR is this idea of the fruitful void, and that those people say I really do enjoy searching searching for secret doors and trying to figure out how to deal with traps and tracking footprints through the woods, and I don't want a skill system for that. I want nothing. That's where I want the rules to get out of my way. And so it's interesting that people seem to never feel that way about combat. That's like the one area where I feel like people feel like they're basically like, I hate rules except combat. Like that's like the one area where like it seems like everybody agrees. It's like, well, that's where you need rules. And it's always very interesting to me because you have these people who say, oh, I could do exploration, I could do skills, quote unquote, without a skill system, or you could say, I could do social interactions, I can do negotiations and stuff like that, and intrigues without a skill system or without a deep mechanical system. But when it came to combat, that seems to be the place where people draw the line in the sand. So,
well, I find it interesting, and I have met people like that. I've had some in my group who I would say that they are very, very different in their strengths than Brandon Lee Mulligan. So I wouldn't want to try to be like, and they're thinking of things the same way, because in fact, they some of them are actually good at crunchier stuff as well, but they're good at role playing when they're in a crunchy game. This is going into a second reason that people might do that. But for some reason, when I bring them into a game where the combat is just sort of more abstracted, even one that's medium weight and not lightweight, like Fate, they will actually like bounce off of the combat, by which I mean do almost the same thing. But they'll take some effort to describe it so that I can say, yes, you can do that. That's something you can do. But mechanically do basically the same thing every round within the bounds of the fiction that's available. And also be less engaged with everything by a little bit.
Well, there's so many things to unpack here.
I know. I have talked about this before when similar topics have come up. So I know you've heard that example before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because the one thing that I think is important to note for me is there's a question of how much time do you, and how much time do you and your group, and how much time does the system expect for you to be spending in this phase of the game? And I think there's something to be said about that. So a lot of people talk about, the relative, what we'll call the lack of depth of, say, the skill system. I don't view that as a bug. I view that as a feature, because the game, fundamentally, Dungeons and Dragons, it didn't want you to spend a lot of time focusing or fixating. I argue. I'm talking about the mechanics, okay? I'm not talking about the way that people actually use the game. I'm talking about the game itself. Dungeons and Dragons are like, hey, we're a game of fantasy adventure. We're a game of delving in dungeons and battling dragons. Okay, so you need to go before the king, and you need to talk to the king, and you need to convince them to lend the group the ancestral sword of the kingdom, the Dragon Slayer sword, so they can go fight the dragon in the dungeon. The game's mechanics go, yeah, we don't want to spend a lot of time on that. Just make a diplomacy check and move on. Let's get to the good stuff. And I think some people view that as a bug, but I think Dungeons & Dragons is saying, no, that's not an area of the game that we expect people to want to spend a lot of time, or that we expect you to spend a lot of time. So we're going to make this a relatively snip, snap, snoop procedure. Pathfinder 2 is fairly similar in its influence system, or its request system, in which you essentially, what's their attitude towards you? You have an opportunity to perhaps change that with a single die roll. And yes, we could add, what I call on my channel, fluffy bullshit time. But, you could add descriptions and you can add all that other stuff. But the truth of the matter is that doesn't really affect the dice roll any more than you're forced to describe how a sword swing looks in a combat. Anyways, long story short, you could resolve that whole thing with a single dice roll. But that is not the case for combat. There is almost no instance of a traditional D20, Trad 20, whatever you want to call it, type game where you resolve combat in a single die roll. Whereas when I, say, run Blades in the Dark, a Forged in the Dark game, I typically resolve entire skirmishes. If your gang gets caught out in the street by a rival gang and they draw their flintlock pistols and their rapiers, I will resolve the entire conflict as a single group check, and that game is fine with that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that combat, so we don't need a lot of combat rules for it. So I think it's kind of interesting because you have these groups that do spend a lot of time negotiating with the king, but then you have a game system which is designed to not support that. But then you have combat where sometimes I think people say it takes too long, but then you have a game system that's designed to make it take long because they assume that that's where you want to be spending, I think, a lot of your time. So I don't know.
So I'm going to bring in the third reason that people might want to do it, and then I'm just going to overall agree with you that it is a good idea to branch out and to try systems that are heavily focused on that non-combat. So the third reason, which is quite the opposite of what I just said there, is that some people are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, whatever their system of choice, from other games that they played that were heavier on combat, and now they want to do a game that's lighter on combat, but they or their players or both just feel comfortable with the system they know and with those rules that they know backing them. They just like, if imagine in the analogy that it's not just like me who's deciding what to get for what I'm driving, but if someone who is like a truck driver all their life, they've driven a truck for 20 years, they can get around the country, they know all the truck stops, they are like a lifelong trucker, and they're more likely to probably maybe want a truck as just what they're using for things that don't require a truck because they know exactly how that truck handles. They don't know as much how a station wagon handles, and maybe they don't want to. So similarly, there's some people who just have this built-in. They have all the books for Dungeons and Dragons. They have a tech solution to play online with their friends in Dungeons and Dragons that they have paid for and can get working, which sometimes can be a pain in the butt, or maybe it's free. And they don't have it for this other system. They have whatever investment into it. And the benefit, the purported benefit of whatever the other system is being better at social stuff, which even some of them will admit it probably is, but it has to be better by enough that it outweighs their comfort and their sunk cost.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And I don't know, I don't think it's finished yet, but our friend, Bob Worldbuilder, was just running a poll on his YouTube, and I'll admit I don't always watch some of the other Dungeon Tubers content. There's not as much there for me. There's sometimes some good stuff. Bob puts out some good stuff, but I do always pay attention to when they do a poll because they have a much bigger audience than me, and it's a much different audience than me. So it's interesting to see how the results vary. And the question was basically like, how many role-playing games have you played, like in your life, in that session?
How many people said 0?
Well, systems. I don't even think that was an option. So that.
Okay. Because I'm interested in how many people because Bob's a pretty chill guy and he's interesting. So there might be people who watched him who literally have never played any role playing system.
That's true.
But maybe he didn't think of that when he was making the poll.
Well, you only get 4 options. So.
Oh yeah, well that is also true. I remember when I tried to make a poll on this channel and 4 was not enough.
That's right. That's why I use my extension, my browser extension, to do polls because I can do more than that. But it was like 40% or something, close to 50. I mean, it wasn't 50%, but it was close. Said 1, and that is still one of those things that's very surreal to me, because if you asked a lot of those people, what's your hobby? Like, what do you do? And they would tell you like, oh, I'm into role playing games. I'm a role player. I like role playing. I like role playing games. I like Dungeons and Dragons. And I think about how many people say that about like board games. And you say, how many board games, I'm a board gamer. Oh, I'm so into board games. Board games is a huge part. Me and my friends, we get together, we do board games. Oh, great. How big's your board game collection? How many board games do you guys play? 1. We only play Settlers of Catan. It's the only game we play. Like that would be very unusual to say the least. Like, and so role-playing games occupy this very strange space, where they do sort of breed this exclusivity and a certain amount of unwillingness, I think, to branch out and to try. So yeah, your third point I think is a good one, which is just that people are just used to playing a game with combat, and so if they don't play a game with combat, it's kind of
Well,
difficult.
no, I'm saying they might play a non-combat game of D&D, but they're still playing D&D because they're used to D&D. And they'd be
I
like,
see.
well, we want to try one that's completely intrigue, and that
Yeah.
rarely, if ever, will we fight. But they just feel the inertia, and they don't want to move on.
Yeah.
And speaking to the settlers example, like, if you talk to enough people, you'll find the people. I knew someone in college who was just like a big fan of Settlers and didn't play any other board game. Wouldn't play any other board game. But like he had his reasons, which were that he thought that if he played more than one board game, that he would get sucked into board games and would not be able to complete his work.
All right, that's a fair assessment. That's a fair assessment. As someone who has spent too much time playing board games, for sure. But yeah, it's interesting because the thing about, can you play D&D without combat? So one of these statements that gets thrown around sometimes by various people, Luke Crane and stuff, is this idea of like system is setting. I'm sure you've heard of that, Mark, right?
Yes. I mean, it's basically the tabletop RPG equivalent of the medium is the message from
Yes.
like Marshall McLuhan for like about different media.
Right. And so there's something to be said. It's really interesting because I have a lot of thought process about why D&D is popular, or why combat is popular. And one of the main reasons that I think combat is popular is because it's basically the most board game-like and procedural element of the entire game. And there's a lot of people, I've seen it with them struggling with Powered by the Apocalypse, and now they're struggling with Daggerheart, where, because think about, I mean, normal D&D, it's this very loosey-goosey, back and forth. You're having a conversation. The GM might ask for a dice roll. They might not. It's how things are going to work. It's not really entirely clear. Sure, And then you get into combat, and it's like, well, you roll for initiative. Everybody gets a turn. We go around it's a lot like a board game. It's your turn. You get to take two actions. You get to move your car. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200 or whatever. Suddenly the rules matter a lot more in combat, and people play it that way. So it's a very board gamey experience, and I think, generally speaking, there's a lot of people who enjoy that. But what's funny is when you take some of these games and you try to add in mechanical support for the stuff that isn't combat, when you try to add in robust mechanical support, say for exploration or social situations, I see people who bounce off of those very frequently cite the reason that they bounced off of them as it was too much like a board game. This is always very strange to me because that's exactly what combat is. And yet that is exactly what people seem to gravitate to combat for. And so the thing is with D&D without combat, all you're left with is this very kind of loosey-goosey, non-procedural game where the GM might be calling for checks occasionally and making stuff up and going through that. And I think that there's a lot of people who dislike that. I think a lot of people enjoy the sort of structure of combat. I've heard a lot of people say that they enjoy that's like, I know I'm going to get one turn. I'm going to get my turn every 10 minutes. And I enjoy that structure. I think
it's
there's
sort of a
feeling...
concrete element to it.
Yes.
Some people can feel like they've gotten lost in games that are more freeform, or just like they're kind of adrift. Whereas because of having that concrete structure, it can allow those sorts of players to like understand, and it can sometimes help them in the loosey-gooseier parts of the game. Just the mere existence of the combat structure, the knowledge of it is the fallback. Moving back to my first point of groups of people, just like we were talking about the person who knows they have a truck just in case they have to haul a ton of manure one day.
Right.
Having this idea that there's this very structured thing that could happen if the situation devolves into combat can sometimes be like almost like an insurance policy or a safety blanket for someone. Whereas if everything could just be anything and one roll suddenly, like my entire army of 30,000 people is dead because Derik decided that would be determined by one roll of the prowl action in Blades in the Dark.
Right.
Which, to be clear, when Derik gave that example earlier in the stream, Blades in the Dark is not prescriptive about telling you that you have to do that much in one. It is very much allowing you to have that big battle if you want it to be a whole bunch of different roles that are made.
A better way to say it
and
is
it can be done as one. It depends on how important it is to the fiction.
Right. Well, the better way to say it is Blades in the Dark doesn't have combat rules. It just has resolution rules. And those resolution rules are the same whether it's a combat, a foot race, a rooftop chase, a tense negotiation. It all uses the same set of mechanical resolution mechanics.
Right. And those mechanics are based on sort of the narrative importance of the situation.
Yes.
How many roles will need to be resolved in order to say that it's cleared.
Yeah.
And that is based on like sort of the feelings of the GM, more or less.
It's pretty vibes based.
And
it
so,
is 100%
like,
vibes based.
It makes it for a fantastic game if you are on the same wavelength as your GM, or you can trust that you are. But if you aren't or you can't, it can be stressful to some players who prefer more structure. Where, especially, I guess, if you had a system where always everything was done in one roll, that might be less stressful to some of the people who need more structure than the ones where maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't even know for sure what's going to happen. I'm going to do my action because in Blades in the Dark, I'm the player. I declare the action. But then the GM is deciding like how far that's going to go. So no, it's interesting, and the reasons are many. But like you said, I think that it would benefit a lot of people to give a shot of running combat list systems. Running a combat list campaign not in D&D or Pathfinder, just to get a chance to learn another RPG. It's a good excuse, because once you learn your first RPG, it's easier to learn your second RPG, and once you've learned your second RPG, it's way easier to learn other RPGs. Now, I get it, though. People sometimes can learn it, but they still feel this, like, comfort, this familiarity, like, this at-homeness with the one that they've played for years and years. Like, it fits like a glove, and, like, the new system is like a new shoe that hasn't been broken in yet. Now, there was a super chat from Joshua Chapman for $5 who says, "Hey, Mark, there's a guy that I know named Derik that doesn't believe in himself and won't publish anything. How would you talk him into it?"
Mark would be the last person to talk to. Mark spends a lot of time with me, and he is well aware of my deficiencies. And Mark, more than anyone, is very aware of how much work goes into making something get published. Mark is not the person to do that, Joshua.
So that is true, but the way that you would talk Derik into it, I think, is to do it slowly over time and not put time pressure into it. Instead of trying to do what was it Joshua asked for earlier in the stream, some kind of a mega dungeon all at once, it would be like, okay, Derik, we know what your speed is. We know how much work goes into it. Let's not do that. In fact, because of the fact that you don't, Derik, philosophically like the idea of dungeons that are like very prescriptive and where you have a set route, and you'd rather have one where you can have sort of a emerging storyline of where you go and when, maybe you would ask Derik to just make one room and then another room later on. And then over the course of some number of decades, Derik might eventually have created a mega dungeon.
You know, and listen, and there's a look, if you're following, if you've been following Stone Top, you know that game has been quote unquote under development for like a decade. So there you go.
Steven says dungeon a day, but for Derik, I'm thinking of more like room a month.
Yeah, there we go. Room a month.
Room a month. And so after a year, that's 12 rooms. After a decade, that's 120 rooms, which is a pretty big dungeon.
That's decent. That's decent.
And if anyone is interested in that idea of not building the whole dungeon all at once, but just kind of going one or a small number of rooms at a time, we actually have an Arcade Mark video that has a surprising number of views for an Arcade Mark video about not building the dungeon all at once. I will link it in the chat so that people can watch it. Maybe you could watch it, Derik, and build one room. I doubt you will, but you could.
So a couple other things from chat. Ito said, funny that a lot of board gamers now see Catan as passe. I will never recommend Catan these days, but I won't turn it down if it was, if someone said, hey, let's play Settlers of Catan. I would say, yeah, sure, we could play. I'd probably say.
It was never my favorite game.
No, it was never my favorite game, but, it's fine. You make some choices and you roll some dice. I mean, it's cool. There's a couple optional rules that I think make the game a lot better, but.
Oh, which optional rules are you thinking of?
So for me, the way that I like it is I like to play with the deck of cards rather than the dice, which is it has a Gaussian distribution.
Yeah, so that it's guaranteed to get a certain amount, so that you don't get the person who picked their thing at like 11, right, so 11, but it was rolled like every single time.
Right, and you have wheat on 6-8, and you haven't gotten a wheat in like 3 rounds of 3 turns. So that's number one. Number two is I'm trying, because some of these came out in various ones. One is if the dice are rolled and it's not the robber, so a 7. If you don't generate any resources, you get a gold coin token, and you can trade 2 gold coin tickets or whatever as wild of any resource. So basically, if you get no resources on a roll, you basically get half of a wild card resource. Basically,
interesting.
I like that. I like that one too.
So these are ways to stop people from getting resource screwed by weird by weird dice.
Well, because the problem is resource screwing in that game is a catastrophic spiraling failure.
Oh yeah.
Because now you need resources to be able to make roads and cities and settlements to get more resources. And so if you don't get resources early on, you then automatically lose the game because other people are going to have more resources than you, which means they're going to be able to outcompete you, outrace you, and then they're going to get even more resources than you, and the cycle continues.
So yes, I actually think one of Catan's biggest weaknesses is when not only can you essentially automatically lose the game, like in the example that you gave, there was one game of Catan that I actually automatically lost almost immediately. Because I was first and fourth, so when I tried to pick like a good space that was like fairly reasonable for first. When I was fourth, there wasn't very much left on the board. Just because of the way that people played, they kind of inefficiencyed the settlements to get good spots. And so after like one go around though, one person got an insane amount of clay and of brick and wood, and they started building this giant road that essentially cut
you off
even my good space between that and the other settlements, so that I could not settle anywhere else, which is therefore incapable of scoring 10 points in the base game of Settlers.
Yeah.
Because I could turn both of my settlements into cities, but then I could not get the other 6 points. It's been a long time since I last played it.
I also like replacing the desert with the lake.
What does that do?
So the lake is a space that on a 2, 3, 11, or 12, it generates, there's a stack of fish tokens. And on a 2, 3, 11, or 12, you get 1 fish token for every settlement, 2 fish tokens for every city. The fish tokens are randomized face down, and the fish tokens will either have an old boot, which is literally nothing, or it'll have 1, 2, or 3 fish on it. And there's a little menu of options that you can trade in the fish. Like as you accumulate them, you can trade them in for development cards. I think you can trade them in for resources. I don't like there being just like a literal dead space on the board. I just think it's not interesting. Like the reason we play board games is so that we have resources and so we can do stuff. And so anything I can do to like empower people to be able to like make more things and do more things and take more actions. Like the worst example of Catan is when you roll your dice. It's your turn. You roll your dice, you roll 4, a bunch of other people get resources, and then you look at your hand and you go, pass. Like you have nothing to do. Like that's just a very, not only is that not fun, but it's not a good game. So
I've also seen house rules to make sheep more useful. And of course there are ways around some of the stuff we were saying involving human interaction. For instance, when I was about to be cut off, because the road was not useful to the person who did it other than to cut me off, I told them, I cannot win this game if you build that road, and I will just never trade with you and make outrageous trade deals with the other people because I can't do anything else. If you build it, please build somewhere else. But they built it anyway. But so there is some fun to be had even when you run into weird situations in games.
Right,
Shall we move back towards the tabletop RPGs though?
Yeah, that was Ito's fault. I apologize.
That's fine. It was an interesting tangent.
So, but Spartan Husky says, for me, I like combat because I don't have to fight for the DM's attention, and that really gets to that idea, right? Of it's about equity, or equanimity. Right? What's the word I'm looking for, Mark?
Yeah, no, I think that equity can be used in there, or but it's not exactly right.
Yeah, it's not exactly right.
I see what you're saying, though.
Yeah, we all get a turn. We all have fundamentally the same bite at the apple. And we all get the opportunity to sort of, add and contribute. The other thing that's good about combat is, and when I say good, I mean, this could be true other places, but I think a lot of other groups struggle with it. Combat is, for number one, ironically, you're kind of favored to win.
I mean, it's not ironic. If you weren't favored to win, campaigns would end on average after 2 combats or less.
Yeah, there you go. Right, exactly. We've talked about this before. The odds, even if the odds are ever slightly not in your favor, after a couple of combats, the odds that your party will have been, TPK'd or at least lost a couple of members would be very high. And it's not unusual to hear people describe how they played for many levels, dozens of combats, and never suffered a death. So
that's right. Like the odds of actually winning the fight overall, even if somebody dies in there, for most tabletop RPGs, not all, some OSR ones might be specifically deadly, but for most is well over 90%. And if 90% sounds like a high odd to win, then I can run the numbers, but if it was literally 90%, your campaigns would fall apart like shockingly quickly. Like let's say that you have a system where you need 10 fights to level up on average. Like the chances of making it to level 5 without a TPK, if you only had a 90% chance to win each battle, is like really, really, really low at that point. Because that's 0.9 to the 50th power, which is basically less than, it's around 0.5%.
Yeah, it's very low.
To make it to level 5.
Right. Well, to be fair, that's like the end game for most people these days, I feel like, right? At least
sure, but would you say that most systems that are out there, that people only 0.5% make to level 5? This proves that the chance is significantly higher than 90% of not having a TPK.
And I don't want to get into a whole separate side tangent, which is why it's crazy that despite that, people still fudge all the time. But and I have a theory for that.
Well, perhaps that's why some people fudge. Maybe there are groups where due to player skill or their own interaction with the game, their chances are not 90% to not TPK, but they don't want to TPK before level 5.
I'm going to tell you why people fudge. In D&D, at least. Okay. Or Pathfinder 2, I suppose. But mostly, I mean, a lot of times it's D&D. Here's the reason why. Because a lot of GMs view, and I'm approaching this from a place of altruism. There are obviously some GMs who fudge because they want to control the story and they want it to unfold exactly the way that they want it to. I think that
get the players.
Or I'll get you next time, Gadget. Right?
So we're talking about the nice GMs who are fudging to save the. Or we'll call them nice. We'll say that their heart is in the right place, perhaps. Although for some players, it's in the wrong place because they want the story to unfold as it would.
Well, yeah. So again, I think that the number of GMs who actually really want to literally control the entire narrative is very low. But what I think GMs feel like they are in a position, which is kind of unfair, is I think GMs feel like they have a duty or an obligation to provide a thrilling, nail-biting combat. Maybe every time or near to it. And I think that if you use the rules as written in most of these game systems, even quote-unquote D&D with its terrible CR system, I think most people would say that a most of these fights, because you are very well, you are very highly designed to win these because of the reasons that Mark mentioned. These average, standard, even slightly difficult fights don't turn up the volume to 10. They don't raise the stakes. They don't get the blood. It's not like, oh my God, we were on the razor's edge of death. And so a lot of GMs feel the need or the obligation to throw really tough monsters, really tough fights at their party, or they use the dice and they cheat in order to provide that artificial enhancement of this emotional stake of we're going to all die. But the problem is that when you turn up the volume too high on, say, the encounter building rules, now suddenly the game is providing this really real challenge. And the GMs realize, implicitly or not, or explicitly, that, I'm going to accidentally, I've pushed this too far. My players are all going to die. And so they kind of decide to walk it back. Because what they were trying to do is give you a roller coaster ride and make you feel like you're on the roller coaster without a seatbelt, right? And without a shoulder strap. But the truth of the matter is they do want you to have a shoulder strap. They do want you to have a seatbelt. And when it comes to rules engines, I think Pathfinder 2 does the same thing. We're trying to provide that roller coaster ride effect. Pathfinder 2 is a lot better at doing that because the combat math is a lot tighter and the encounter balancing rules are a lot better than they are in D&D 5th edition.
That's sort of a goal, is to give you an interesting, maybe not thrillingly nail-biting, but interesting and exciting combat a high percentage of the time, where the players might actually raise their eyebrows and start getting worried, even though the GM who's sitting in the back and watching the monster's health bar compared to what the players are actually losing is thinking, no way am I going to actually win this fight. But to still make the players sweat a bit, being like, ooh, it did that. How long until we take it down?
Right. And we've all seen this before as GMs or, people who know better. You'll watch some group and they'll just be like sweating bullets and you go, oh, you guys are so fine. Like, you're
That's
so
actually
good.
what you want, is to secretly know that they're so fine and that they've got it while they're sweating a little and feeling excited.
But,
you don't want that?
No. No,
why do you not want them to be able to get the excitement while you secretly know that it's going to go fine for them?
I want to be excited too, Mark. I'm a player too. I want to be. I don't want to know how things are going to end up either or turn.
Well, I mean, the dice can sometimes foil you even at that point, and that can be very exciting. Which is why I let things roll as they may.
Yes, right. Which I like dice for that reason. You're absolutely right. 100%. But so
the unfortunate pumpkin in chat is saying it feels deceptive if you know that they're doing fine, but that the players are excited and they're feeling worried about it. But I don't think it is deceptive. It's a game of limited information. You have enough information to know that they're actually fine, whereas they're sweating because they see that the opponent is a challenging opponent. But you are not sweating because you know that they have the tools they need, that they're almost definitely going to win in the end.
All right, so let me ask you this.
No one's deceiving in that point. There's it's just that they don't know everything that you know.
Let's say Steven, your boss, it impresses upon you, or you have the feeling that if you don't get this chapter done by the end of the week, it's going to be disastrous for the project and it's going to fall apart. And you feel this like, I really need to get this project done. But your boss, Steven, actually knows that you could turn it in by the end of the month and it would be fine because there's a million other things that are backed up and it doesn't actually matter if you get them to him this week. Is that deceptive?
Did he tell me that he needs it right now? Or do I just not? I just kind of thought, I decided that he needed it now. And
yeah, I mean, you're right. That is a very gray area.
That's different. That is deceptive. But I've actually heard.
I think most GMs are selling it. I think most GMs are gaslighting their players a little bit. I think most GMs are like, oh, you guys are in trouble now. Oh, you just got critical hit. Oh, how many hit points do you have left? Only 10. That's not nearly going to be enough against this guy. I think most GMs sell it because they want to crank up the emotional tension. And
I think it depends on your players.
No,
some of the players are able to crank up their emotional tension on their own and get stressed out about it on their own, and then you don't have to. But you give an interesting example because of the fact that I think that you may have been in one of the conversations at a convention with this, where we were talking to Jess about it, who said that she, in some cases, and some other freelancers actually prefer to have somebody who is going to tell her a deadline, even if they made it up. Because that will help her do it. Whereas if you're just like, well, get it when you can, then she maybe at the time is like, well, that's very lenient, that's good. But then like later regrets it compared to if you had just made up at least some kind of guess of what a good time would be. And then we're flexible about it later. So that actually depends on the person. There actually are people who appreciate having like a
they want to be lied to,
like having the Scotty the Scotty deadline, or I guess it's the opposite of that.
Right, it is. But yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's like that episode from Next Generation where he tells LaForge like, but what's it really going to take? And he's like, I told 2 hours. He's like, oh no, you're not going to be a miracle worker if you just tell him how long. So, I mean, to be clear in chat, the way I resolve this issue is I roll all my dice in public, and I make/let my players track the monster's hit points. So my players are always very aware of, and when I play on a VTT, I usually have the hit point resources public, or at the very least, I use like a mod that basically says, whether they're not injured, barely injured, moderately injured, severely injured, death approaching. Like, so you basically like 20% chunks of text. So something like that. But anyways, so what I was going to get to is, this is actually where this point was trying to make. In combat, you are scheduled to win, more or less. And outside of combat, I think that the game gives dungeon masters a lot more carte blanche. And Mark was talking earlier about like, the GM might just decide, with a single die roll, your entire army is wiped out. And it's like, it almost feels like
I was talking about that for other systems, but you're right that can happen literally in D&D or Pathfinder. Right. In fact, I have seen players get infuriated by not just it being a single die roll, but just that the way that something like that is resolved being anything other than combat. Because of the fact they know that combat is stacked heavily in their favor. They know that maybe it's stacked even more heavily than the system wanted it to be in their favor because they min-maxed their character. Like, that the system wanted it to be stacked 97% in their favor, but they got it to be stacked 99.99999999999% in their favor by min-maxing. But because they were then told, well, no, actually, look, the game assumes that your third level character cannot kill this army of 10,000 level 15 demons. I know your third level character can kill the army of 10,000 level 15 demons because you were that min-maxed. But the game assumed that we're running a public, organized play campaign, so we have to use the mass combat rules. And they're like, what? In the mass combat rules, I have like a plus 15 against 20 to attack this army. That's a 4 and 20 that I will miss it. But my third level character has a 90, only on a natural 1 do I not kill all of those 10,000 level 15 demons in one hit if I use the regular combat system that I know. And so it's sometimes, you're right, that other systems or other ways of adjudicating things are less stacked in people's favor. And so players would much prefer to use the stacked in your favor combat system, particularly, and looping back to another thing you said about a lot of the character build choices going into combat, because they most likely optimized for combat. This is another reason why using another system might be better if you're not running combat, because the characters might wind up being really unbalanced in your game with no combat if they were built using a system that tried to be balanced in combat. Like, if you're playing Pathfinder 2 and one person's an investigator and the other person is a barbarian, and you're playing a social intrigue mystery campaign with no combats, well, in fighting, the barbarian and the investigator are both going to be great, and the barbarian's probably better, but they're close, and they both are going to contribute. But in this campaign, the barbarian might, use survival to track someone every once in a while, although the investigator has it too. But the investigator is going to blow the barbarian out of the water. They might be doing 10 times as much stuff as the barbarian is.
I think you just actually, though, hit the real nail on the head, which is because people were talking about this earlier, and it's absolutely right, which is this. If I tell you that I am running a D&D game, okay, so I'll use two different ideas. If I tell you that I am running a D&D campaign and there wasn't a lot of combat, you hear that's, you might say, here's somebody, somebody was talking about like Critical Role, right? The 4-hour episode without a single combat. If I tell you, I'm running a D&D game, and yeah, like it has combat, but it doesn't really have combat. I am willing to bet that most people are thinking or imagining game sessions, hours long, Critical Role style, where there's no dice rolls or very minimal dice rolls, or there's almost no stakes in the dice rolls. And it's basically all just, what people call role playing, which again, I view the entire hobby as role playing, but whatever people call role playing. Whereas when I tell people, like, for example, I could tell you I ran a Legend of the Five Rings campaign. It went, 6 or 7 sessions. It was like a mini campaign. And we had one combat. And so people might hear that and go, oh, so the rest of it was just you guys all role playing? No, the rest of it was us using the game's mechanical systems for resolving various situations using dice rolls. Actually, there was a lot of dice rolls.
It just wasn't combat.
It just wasn't combat. And so I think the end result is people like to roll dice and they like to use their characters. And when people hear D&D without combat, the usual assumption there is you're just shooting the shit and, role playing and making stuff up, and there's no dice rolls, and you're not getting to use your character. Even though the game has technically skills that handle this, number one, there's a lot of people who just flat out skip those skills or, don't call for them. Or number two, even if they do cover them or use them, to be honest with you, those skills aren't particularly deep. The mechanics aren't super rich and rewarding. D&D,
and even when you have a game where it is, or there are like optional supplements you can add where it is, because of the game's fundamental underpinnings, it's not actually going to give you a balanced experience that way. Like, for instance, let's suppose that you are using Pathfinder 2's subsystems, which are have a pretty robust way to do a lot of different things. Honestly, the victory point tracks are very akin to things like clocks in some other RPGs. They can do pretty much any of the tech that you might want to do in some of those other RPGs. The problem is that you have all this other stuff that was there for combat, and that in character building, that stuff was heavily weighted.
Yes.
And so that this causes it, even when there is depth, there's not enough weight put to it into the resource cost of being good at that part of the game, such that it is very, very easy. Even though in Pathfinder 2, it's actually not that easy to build a character that is not going to be able to contribute in combat unless you're actively trying to be bad or make one of 2 rookie mistakes that the game even tells you not to do when you're building your character, like not putting up your key attribute or something like that, right? But it's very easy to make a character that would contribute way worse in a no combat game, because the guide rails to make sure that you have a minimal competence are built for combat.
Well, that's the irony about it too, is that you end up with these games where, you mentioned the Barbarian and the Investigator. There's a lot of people that I've seen run games in person on YouTube or whatever like that, where that differentiation actually wouldn't really matter that much, because they don't use, Brennan Lee Mulligan comes to mind. He doesn't use those systems, right? So at that point, the only thing that you're building for is combat, because all the other mechanical resolution systems the GM is mostly ignoring and is just going based off of, how you describe it. In fact, in some ways, you could almost say Brennan Lee Mulligan runs a kind of old school game, because in old school games, you didn't have a skill system. You didn't have a robust mechanical subsystems,
OD&D before the Thief class.
Yeah, OD&D before the Thief class. There was no skill system. There was no resolution system besides, I don't know, talk to the GM, describe what you're doing. The GM will make a call. The GM will base it based off of the fictional state of the situation and what your character said. The only thing we really have rules for is swinging swords, because that's something where I guess we all just decided. I mean, the games came from war games. I mean, that's the only thing we did have rules for. It's basically. I mean, that's kind of what it happened for. And so yeah, and so in some ways, yeah, you could argue that like a lot of people say Brendan Lee Mulligan's style is very narrative. I actually think it's not. I think it's actually kind of old school in that way. It's like an OSR game.
Well, some aspects of old school games could be very narrative.
Yeah.
If you play in old school style and then rarely use combat, which, to be clear, the idea of combat is deadly, you might die every time. Try to defeat the enemies using like some unfair thing that you did before the combat that just auto kills them, because if you actually go into a fight, you have a decent chance of losing. Like, that encourages the idea of not getting into too many combats. Even though, also, there are giant dungeon crawls with lots of combats in them in old school adventures. But, like, the ethos of it is every combat could be your last. Eke out advantages, player skill.
I do want to highlight, though, a couple of things. Because, again, this is one of those things where things get lost in the sauce. And people don't fully understand or appreciate how integrated these ecosystems were. If you look at a typical, say, old school D&D game, module dungeon or whatever. And number one, you have to realize, you might say, wow, you know, this is a very dangerous game. You know, people die at 0 hit points. My starting character has 6 hit points. The orc does 8 points of damage. You know, they could just literally die right away. But you have to realize a couple things. Number one, that things like encounter distance and surprise were much more aggressive in those editions, and oftentimes slanted towards the player's advantage. Number two, reaction roll was a part of the game. So a good chunk of combat, a good chunk of encounters that you encountered, the DM was supposed to roll randomly.
And they might not attack you.
In fact, they often didn't. In fact, statistically, they usually did not. Now, there were some monsters that, like undead or whatever.
It depends on what type of thing. But honestly, those editions, when you're talking about especially things like animals or those kind of beasts, it's way more realistic to the way that those kind of creatures actually would behave in any reasonable sense. Because the same thought process behind a tabletop RPG of you need like over a 90% chance every time, by a significantly over, or you'll TPK. That is how predators in the real world,
right? Because a predator can't afford.
That is how they act.
To lose.
Yes, they only need to lose once, and then that's it. So they do not go after CR appropriate challenges in a fair fight or whatever. They are like realistically an animal, even a predator, size up their prey. They attack when they are sure they are going to win. Right. Or at least for whatever reason, maybe they got angered because of their territory or what have you. But in many situations, they will try to do a threat display instead of attacking you and try to get you to back off. Because even if they win in the real world, an animal that gets injured in a close fight and wins, that they might not be able to get enough food the next day because of their
because of the cost of that battle.
That's right.
And then I was going to say the last thing is another system that was not optional. This was codified into the very DNA of the game system. Was a morale system where, you know, if you had a group of 8 goblins, chances were pretty reasonable that as soon as one of them, you know, it's just like a you know, kids fighting on the street. You know, the moment one person actually gets hit, it's a lot of posturing and shoving and people doing stuff. But the moment somebody actually gets hit, a lot of times everyone just runs away because they're like, oh, okay, like the consequences are real, the stakes are real. Now I'm out. And it's like, you know, if you have a bunch of goblins who are like defending their turf and they're being really aggressive, and then all of a sudden the wizard opens up an arcane portal and magical missiles streak unerringly and strike their leader dead. Yeah, the rest of them they're done. They're leaving. They're like, I'm not.
You need to know when to cut and run.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of in newer RPGs, a lot of the time it is more prescribed. Like, no, you're fighting it. Like, how many times have I seen in D&D 3rd edition adventures or Pathfinder 1st edition adventures, the line morale, the creature fights to the death. And even sometimes on like humans who were like mercenaries who weren't even like ideologically
Right.
They weren't
were
even
working for money.
ideologically like into this. They were just someone paid them money
Right.
to do the thing. And it's like, yeah, the
I,
mercenaries fight to the death. It's like, why?
I will say, in these adventures, chaotic evil creatures are surprisingly resolute and determined creatures to fight for their the powers that be.
Well, look, Derik, sometimes you're chaotic evil just because you're kind of craven and greedy, but some people are chaotic evil ideologues who really care about chaos and evil.
Okay,
I played a character like that
dedicated.
one time, and she was so dedicated to helping everyone else become chaotic evil and then creating more demons.
So she was lawfully aligned to chaos.
She was not lawfully aligned because she was lying to everyone and manipulating people into just doing what they wanted to do deep down, and that society told them or the laws told them they couldn't do.
All right. Well, outside of weird philosophical ideologues, I'm talking about like goblins or something.
Or like this random mugger in the alleyway.
Yeah, this random mugger. Well, and by the way, speaking of, we talked about morale rolls. You mentioned reaction rolls, or I mentioned reaction rolls, but a lot of times those same encounter blocks will say attacks immediately.
Yes.
And then it'll say morale fights to the death.
Fights to the death.
So,
and it's just okay, it's a guaranteed fight. We get it, but
yeah,
sometimes it can just be more interesting even if you ignore those in published adventures. I've had so much fun even in adventures that say fights to the death or that they just attack immediately, just like sort of heisting those dungeons and like going in and pretending to be someone who was supposed to be there, or that it was made up of an alliance of evil groups and pretending to be part of one of the groups to destabilize the
I think you'd be surprised how many
ecosystem.
I think you'd be surprised. I think there's an unhealthy attitude amongst a lot of GMs who feel like the players are kind of getting away with something when they do that, like they're cheating in some ways. I even wonder if there's not players who feel that way.
Well, I think this circles back to the combat and why it needs to have the stricter rules. There aren't. And there are some players who, like we said before, like, wait, I might not win, or wait, I might lose all of this in one die roll. But there's also players who feel like if it was like, okay, we've been playing for 50 sessions of this long-running Blades in the Dark game. We finally found the real mastermind who is causing all these problems in Duskval. They've brought our crew has managed to try them down. We've gone to their base. They came out with their strange like artifact that is streaming ghost essence out of themselves, and then he's like, all right, well, I roll a prowl, and I got a 6, and the GM's like, all right, you kill them all. And so there are some people who'll be like, I feel really disappointed and like I didn't earn that because we spent 50 sessions and then I rolled a 6 on a prowl and now it's done. And it didn't even have that many bad consequences because it was a 6. So there are some people who like, but if you told them, oh, look, you ran this long combat system and the numbers went down, even though actually getting that 6 on a prowl was pretty unlikely compared to winning in that complicated combat system that's rigged in your favor, they would feel more earned from that combat system.
Player psychology is wild, but you're absolutely right. You're like, the numbers went down immediately. I'm like, okay, so you wanted to lose? You're like, no, I wanted to win after 5 rounds. Oh, okay. Whereas, like I've told this story before, but my first 3rd edition campaign that went all the way to 20, it took, 2 years, give or take. And the final fight was against this half-dragon template Baylor, advanced Baylor. And the barbarian had a Vorpal sword, and he cut off the Baylor's head in the first round of combat. And everybody was like, that was the best ending we could have ever possibly had. Nobody, they're like, look, like a scoreboard,
People always remember that when that weird thing happens, especially if you also have some resolutions that aren't always like that. I had a campaign where the party who had previously been like working for the spy master of the Jade Emperor decided to overthrow the Jade Emperor in this setting, and they had a lot of tough fights, but against the Jade Emperor, he was going to use his throne to command all dragons like all dragons to go after the PCs, and there were a lot in the local area. Before he could act to command the dragons, which would have then created the encounter that had all these other dragons that would start coming in waves, the PC mage managed to disintegrate the Jade Regent, who rolled a natural 1, which was the only roll that could have failed against the disintegrate because his bonus was so high. And it was like maximized and it did so much damage. And someone else had like chipped him for a small amount because it actually wouldn't have been enough on its own. And so he was just disintegrated. Teamwork. And he didn't get his turn. And they were, and you know, some people might have felt that was very anticlimactic. They didn't fight any of the dragons. Yeah. The spy master they worked for was actually secretly a dragon herself and was going to be forced to turn on them. There was a lot of things that were going to happen. They loved it though. And that player loved it. Even the other players who didn't get to do anything thought that was fantastic because it was rare. Whereas if it had happened every time, I think they wouldn't have.
Yeah, absolutely. We were playing a campaign once. I was a wizard, a high level wizard, and my buddy, my buddy Aaron was DMing, and we had been the thorn in the side of this like growing evil threat or whatever. Anyway, long story short, we were being very callous and nonchalant, and they sent an assassin after us, and he had built this NPC and he had all this gear, and the assassin killed me, killed the party's cleric, so we both got killed, and managed to do some damage before he was forced to flee, and we got resurrected or whatever like that, and you know, obviously we were like, okay, we were being lazy, and we did some scrying. We located him. I teleported in. I hit him with a disintegrate. He was a rogue. His fort save wasn't that high. And he failed the save, and he turned into a pile of dust surrounded by a bunch of magical items. And we started sweeping up the magical items into our bag of holding. And the GM was like, yep, okay, that's that. You know, like, that's just it. And everyone was like, yeah, that was very satisfying. Like, screw this assassin. Yeah, so it's very performative. I think the way that a lot of people engage with combat, it's less about combat and it's more about, I want to go through the motions. And I think
it's about gaining the narrative weight to feel justified in the victory, to feel like the victory was earned. It's like in a fiction, in a book.
Yeah.
And it depends. Some people like those books where it's just like suddenly this very important villain or hero dies for seemingly out of nowhere to like a stray shot. But in a lot of cases, just having that build up leading towards it where you can see this feels earned in the narrative, this is where things are going, can help people feel better about it.
Well, that's
and the
other
combat
thing too.
Like serves as that for some people. And I'm not saying that systems that are based only on resolutions can't do that too. Like, nothing in Blades in the Dark is actually forcing you to, like we said before, to do that giant fight after 50 sessions with just one roll. In fact, I would argue you probably shouldn't. But it depends on your group and how you do things out. It depends on the situation. Maybe they did a lot to get there before that fight. But if they didn't, you probably do want to have a little bit more to it than that. But the fact of the matter is that systems that don't tell the GM that means that the GM has to know that or learn that. And maybe some people who are watching this video won't agree with me and will say, no, yeah, it should always just be one roll.
Well, I think the other thing about combat is it's very immediate and clear. What's at stake? What do we get if we win? What do we get if we lose? What happens if we win? What happens if we lose? How do we achieve victory? How do we not lose? Right? All of those things are just crystal clear. And there's no like ambiguity. There's no level setting. It's very, much like we know what we have to do. They know what they have to do. We know what victory looks like. We know what a loss looks like. And in honest respect, to games like D&D and other D20 type games, it's not always entirely clear what the consequences or the stakes are for roles or skills or even activities that are made outside of combat. And to give you an example of this, last year, I ran 2 Torchbearer campaigns, which is a weird Luke Crane game about dungeon exploration. And in that game, there is a conflict system, not a combat system. It's a conflict system, and it can handle all sorts of conflict. And one of the conflicts that it handles is social conflict. And people go, oh, yeah, social conflict. Okay, but the difference is, in this game, the PCs can lose the social conflict. And that doesn't mean that you didn't convince the king to give you the Dragon Slayer sword. It means that the king convinced you to do something for him. Or that the king has changed your opinion. Or the king has changed your belief. So imagine playing D&D, and let's say that you actually were playing with the ideals, bonds, and flaws, which I know nobody does, but let's say that you were. And imagine that you got into a social conflict and lost, and as a result of that, the DM had the ability to change or erase one of your character's bonds or backgrounds or your alignment. Suddenly you're like, oh, there's a lot more stakes at this. Which is funny that people balk at that, because in combat the stakes
people balk at that all the time.
I know,
almost
that's what I'm saying,
any
everything. But in combat,
people don't like having their agency removed.
Right. People don't.
So
people
they don't like it when
agency.
the NPCs can diplomacy them.
Right. People don't like having their agency removed. So what is killing them? I would view that as the ultimate loss of agency.
I think that they feel at that point that means that the character is dead. So, whereas they still had full agency over that character and their death.
Okay, what if your character gets charmed or dominated?
Yeah, people don't like that either. A lot of people do. When I say people, obviously I don't mean everyone, right? There are a lot of people who really, really don't like when their character gets charmed or dominated.
Right.
But they like it even less when they're told that it wasn't a magic spell, because for some reason. Right. And this is an issue in any game that has magic, and was definitely an issue for making Pathfinder 2, where magic didn't just trump all of the skills and make them completely useless. Right. People are willing to accept it if you say, oh, well, it was magic. A lot more than they are if you don't say that.
Right.
For just on like any topic. And so I would say there are some people who won't accept charmed or dominated, but there's some who will, but only because it was magic. But if it wasn't, they won't accept it.
Right. You're absolutely right. But so I think that, the question of can you play D&D without combat, I think the problem is, and the reason why I say yes, but maybe you shouldn't, is because nothing else in the game has any real defined stakes that are, you're just rolling the dice and seeing what happens. There's no, when you play like a Powered by the Apocalypse game or whatever, every dice roll, whether you're in combat or not, has the potential for the failure to generate a new consequence and a new problem and a new issue in the storyline. In most of these D20 games, when you roll low and you fail a check or whatever, the consequence is you just didn't succeed. And there's a big difference between if you pass, something good happens. If you fail, something bad happens. Versus if you pass, something good happens. If you fail, nothing happens. That's a very big difference. And in combat, this is true. If you pass, you hit and do damage. If you fail, you miss and do nothing. So that you might say, well, so that's true. So why is combat different? Well, the difference is that doing nothing in combat carries with it the explicit cost of now the enemy's going to get to attack you and do damage to you. And so missing is its own form of a penalty.
Whereas out of combat, if it's something that doesn't take a lot of time, there's essentially not much, or maybe not any opportunity cost to having made the check.
Exactly. And so I think there's just a natural reaction to maybe even like, you might even be consciously aware of it, of going, combat is a lot more interesting in this game because there feels, and you're right to think this way, that even though you're 99% likely to probably win this fight, it feels like there's a lot more riding on this skill check than it would be if it wasn't in combat. And so,
and that last 1% of losing the fight can happen. Okay, yeah. I've heard stories like Steven has his own story about a guy who was falling in the volcano. It's like, I think I should be able to just grab the edge of the volcano randomly. Maybe there's a platform below me. And Steven said, okay, maybe there are. You're right. You pointed out that in geology, there could be platforms below you in the caldera or whatever. We'll roll a D100. And if it's a 100, then there is. And it was a 100. And so, like, the 1% can happen. And more importantly, let's say that you have a game with a 1% chance of a TPK, that game probably of those 1% TBK, there may have been for each one, there may have been 10 to 20 that were really tense,
right,
and that seemed close even to the GM. And that means that you're getting that in 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 of the fights. And so that 99% success rate for not TPKing also hides within it like that a character died or you lost some secondary success condition where like something burned down because you didn't deal with the fire or rescue the hostages. So there is still a lot of excitement and interest that you can have in a game with a 99% chance not to completely fail in an encounter. To be clear, it's not all smoke and mirrors where the GM is just cackling because they know it's a victory for every single fight for 99 fights in a row. Usually even the GM thinks that something could go wrong in a few of those.
Well, the other thing about combat is, and this is true because a lot of GMs in D&D aren't using alternative systems like a clock or a victory point track. I mean, they're all kind of the same thing. But what those things do is they insulate you from because the way that combat works is basically it allows for you're advantaged. And that means that the more rolls you make, the more likely the more probable it is that the most likely situation and the most likely outcome is going to occur, right? As you make more and more rolls, you get closer and closer to the expected outcome, right? It's the larger law of numbers. But when you're outside of combat and you're making these single one-off die rolls, there's a lot of, risk to this. I remember years ago, before I knew about clocks, I was playing a superhero game, and the reactor core was going critical, and it was this great dramatic moment, and the character who was kind of like a Hank McCoy beast type character, really smart but also like a monster, kind of pulled a Spock, where in Wrath of Khan,
the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
So he goes, very dramatic moment. He goes inside. I mean, again, I steal blatantly and often from IPs. In fact, I steal blatantly from IPs that I know my players know and appreciate, so that they could go like, cool, this is just like Spock. And he gets in there, and I go, okay, make a engineering check or a computers check, and I make the DC, reasonable. He's probably going to pass it. He has a really high skill. And he rolled like a 2. And I was very vague about like the stakes. And so it was kind of like one of those situations where I like didn't expect him to fail. And now I was like, again, this is a much younger Derik. And I was kind of like, the warp core begins to destabilize even further. Make another check, because I was basically telling him, keep rolling the dice until you pass. That's what I was telling him, because
at that point you could have just not called for a check and just been like, your sacrifice saves the people.
Right. But we didn't have the game tech for that we have nowadays, because you don't
need game tech to not call for a check.
You're right. Well, technically you are right. Technically, Root and Arcs, the board games, existed in the 1950s. No one just bothered to write it down yet. We were stuck playing Battleship and Monopoly. But like,
no, I'm just saying that like not doing a thing like that. I'm not saying you should have been able to figure out a way to like add in the devil's bargain mechanic from Blades in the Dark.
Well,
I'm saying
I was 18, Mark.
Oh no, and I'm not saying you should have been able to either. When I was 18, I made a lot of bad GM calls too. But I think that a lot of people, even at that time period, were just skipping dice rolls for situations where someone was doing some kind of giant sacrifice.
Yeah,
I would probably have rolled it anyway and then let their sacrifice kill them for no gain if they had gotten the horrible roll.
Right, and
then people would remember it in the same way they remember disintegrating the Jade Regent as a horrible thing that happened where Spock just died for no reason.
The difference is that yes, Greyhawk, you are correct. What I should have done is on the spot back in 2001, just ad hoc out of my butt created Blades in the Dark and stolen the resistance mechanic.
Yeah, there you go.
But like nowadays, I still like the idea of rolling the dice because I like having that uncertainty. But what I like the ability is I basically say, look, you're going to save the ship. we're not rolling to see if you save the ship. We're rolling to see if you survive, right? That's the way I would do that and phrase that now. If you pass the check, and yes, you are 90% likely or 80% likely to pass this check. If you pass the check, you're able to shut down the warp core and do so in such a way that your character maybe is badly radiation burned, but will recover. If you fail the check, you will be able to shut down the computer, the warp core, before it goes critical, but you will not be able to do so in such a way that you'll be able to save yourself. And I would explain those stakes very clearly before the player even went into that radiation chamber. And now we're not worried about fucking over our story, because what I was getting at was that the superheroes, there's this genre emulation. No, everyone at the table has a certain level of buy-in of, we want him to save the ship. That we don't want that to be up to debate. But we still want there to be some sort of something that we're rolling for, something at risk, something that we're invested in. And if you say, okay, if you pass, you save the ship and you're severely injured. If you fail, you save the ship and you're dead. And I think that would be how modern Derik would handle that situation.
And as Demenkus Priest mentions in chat, degrees of success give you even more options, because then you could be like, if you critically fail, you're dead and you don't save the ship. If you fail, you can choose whether to save the ship or to survive. I assume you're going to choose to save the ship because you went in there in the first place, but I'm going to leave that up to you after you've seen that you failed. If you succeed, you can save the ship, but you will be horribly wounded. It will take some time to recover. And if you critically succeed, you save the ship and you're mostly fine. You've just got some radiation burns. Maybe take a tricorder or something. And I don't know. And tricorders have the ability to also...
tricorders have every ability that they need
to also heal you a little. I think I've seen people do that.
Yeah. Well, you need a medical tricorder.
Yeah, the medical tricorder. I was thinking of that one.
They're a little bit bigger, and they've got that thing that pops out that goes...
The dongle that lets you do the healing thing.
It's the Bluetooth. It's the Bluetooth healer. But anyways, and then of course, obviously, if you critically succeed, not only are you fine, but you've actually managed to boost the warp output by 20%, and the ship gets away extremely scot-free and no damage to it whatsoever.
Well, I think that depending on if the engineer is the one who did it, then if you failed, then the ship would get away scot-free.
Right. This is actually... not really a D&D combat thing, but this is actually one of the reasons why I really like some of the skill roll mechanics that Magpie uses in their PBTA game, because basically they use the standard PBTA nomenclature of 3 tiers of success, right? 6 minus, the GM makes a move. 7 through 9, you succeed, but there's a cost, and 10 or higher, you succeed with no cost. But what they have in that game is basically say, but if you're skilled at this thing, if you roll a 6 minus, you still succeed, but it's at an extreme cost. So it's like, basically the idea is that, like, if this is the thing that you're good at, you basically kind of can't fail. And it's funny that people will say, I don't like that. And I go, they're like, I don't like the idea that my character can't fail. And I'm like, well, tell me about your character in D&D. And they go, well, they're a character with a plus 38 to athletics. And it's like, well, okay, what are we talking about then? What are we doing? I don't understand. Didn't you just make a character who can't fail? Well, yeah. Okay. People are trippy, man. Anyways. Yeah, Derik, Slugbuster has abilities to let you mark a stress to move a 1 to 3 to a 4 to 5, and those are neat. Yeah, that's kind of the same vibe, Derik. That I like those abilities. So, anyways, when it gets back down to D&D, my problem with it is that the mechanics of D&D are not set up in a way, I think, to satisfyingly and structurally support non-combative play. That doesn't mean you could use what I would consider to be inferior tools to accomplish your goal. Yes, I could hammer in. I could put up a fence with nails and wood, and I could beat in all the nails with the butt end of a screwdriver. I could do that. It would work. I don't recommend it. I recommend you get a hammer. In fact, actually, if you're going to be doing that many nails, I recommend you get a nail gun, but you could do it. And so while I think that, can you play D&D without combat? Yes. Should you? I'm actually going to say no. I don't think you should. I think D&D, look, you also have to respect the game. People are making their characters. There's a lot of fun little options for them to choose. we play these games because we like to pick these little fun, crunchy, fiddly bits, and we want to get to we want to see them used, and we want to get a chance to use Great Weapon Master or Sentinel or whatever I don't know what they are in 2024. And to be honest with you, I don't really know what they are in 2014 either. But you want to be able to use Action Surge, and you want to be able to use your Cunning Action, and you want to be able to rage and do all that other stuff. So I think that's understandable. I think that's very, very reasonable because so much of your character's mechanical structure about that. And so if you just skip over that,
like with the exception of the few examples I gave much earlier in the episode of people who have a specific other reason why they don't want to move on or go to another game, which could just be inertia or just familiarity, some of those kinds of things. And even in those cases, that is just like another counterbalance that for them has pulled the scales in the other direction. But there is some amount of should. And I use the word should knowing that I've talked to some people who think of should in a way that I think of as must. And it's a little weird because then I've said, okay, so if you think that if I say should, then that means you have to do it. Then what does must even mean? And they're like, well, that means that not only do I have to do it, but also you're being really mean about it, basically. And should also means that you have to do it. So to be clear, when Derik here is saying should, I won't put words in your mouth, but when I am agreeing with him, I mean should as in like, it's probably a good idea to think about it. It would help you in some ways. If you have a counterbalancing factor, maybe you won't do it. And I'm not going to say that you're wrong or you're bad or that you made a poor choice there. But you should consider it. And you will gain something from it. Even if what you gain from staying with your system of choice in a combatless game may be greater for some people.
Well, Cinnabos, do you mean a game, when you say it still has a combat system, would you try combat less? I mean, there's a lot of games. Traveler, Legend of the Five Rings. I think you
just mentioned you had how much 6-7 sessions with no combat.
Right.
Exactly. But it has a combat system.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of games. I mean, the thing is the fundamental fantasy of Dungeons and Dragons is heroic sword fighting adventure and against ferocious monsters and terrible villains. So I think that's part of the issue. But also, to be clear, I think those other systems that quote unquote have a combat system also have more robust systems, mechanical systems for those non-combat list things. Because to be very clear, I don't want to be on the show and seem too agreeable and not give a hot take. I think people that sit around and play D&D or any of these games that have all of these mechanics, and they play for 3 or 4 hours and they don't use any mechanics and they just role play, which again, I think they're doing it wrong. So I think you're doing it wrong is the way I could. I don't think you're doing it right. You might be still having fun. That's totally fine. But it's like I said, like
what if they're doing it right for them?
Nah. Yeah. No. I mean, that's okay. But you might be having fun, but no. I don't buy. I think the system matters, and I think again, like I've said this, I've given this example before on my live stream. Everyone, most people know that I'm a big Magic the Gathering player, and I remember once I was sitting at a coffee shop and I saw these 2 teenagers, and they had like Magic the Gathering cards, and it looked like they had either just bought the decks or maybe they were very new to the game. And I'm watching, this one girl, she's pulling out her cards and they're doing something, and I could tell they're going to have a very bad experience because they are playing the game that when they cast a spell, I think they're like throwing away their lands or something like that. It's very problematic. But they're having fun, and I didn't want to get into this. Like, I didn't want to be like, man, I didn't want to come over there and mansplain to them how to play Magic the Gathering, but they were having fun, and so I let them have it. But would I say that they were playing the game right because they were having fun? No, I would say they're playing the game wrong. But they're still having fun.
What you were saying is that they destroyed lands when they were using them for mana?
Yeah. When they were tapping their lands, they were discarding them.
Okay.
And so
that I would say that they were not playing the game correctly.
No, they were not. But they were having fun. So
how did they even
I don't know,
Get
because
out
they had no
spells.
Mark, they had no other context. They had
No,
no
but
other
I'm not saying
context
how
than-
did they make the mistake. How did they get out spells at any
because they
rate
would,
when they were discarding
well,
all those lands?
you know,
Were they
because
drawing 3 cards per turn?
no, but they would eventually get 2 lands, and then they
Was the
cash it
game
in for
did the game like take like 20 turns to like
Oh, I'm sure it took forever.
because you had to
but-
just keep drawing until you got
Yeah.
more lands to play your cards? Okay.
Right, like the one I remember watching, the one girl, she sat there, or the one kid, he sat there and like waited till he had like 5 lands. He didn't cast any spells the whole game until he had like 5 or 6 lands to play, and then he discarded them all to play like a big 7/7, or something like that, that cost all 6 of his lands. And his opponent, the girl, was just like, "Oh, I can't, I give up. I can't possibly beat that," which is fair the way they were playing. They're kind of, and in their mind, they were like, "Oh, I see the strategy of the game. You got to cast nothing for the first 10 turns of the game so that you can cast this really big monster and take the game over." And I'm like, "Oh my God, what is happening?" But they were having fun. So to me, this was like the most stalwart example. Anybody who's played Magic the Gathering knows just how wrong that is, but they're having fun. So a lot of people would say they're doing it right. Don't yuck their yum. The point of Magic the Gathering is to have fun.
So I would say that this is different.
Oh, now suddenly this is
Yeah,
different.
no, I would say that this is different.
Okay.
I would say that this is different because in the case of playing Dungeons and Dragons but not doing combat, you may be following all of the rules of the game.
All right, fair enough. All right,
Like,
I'll buy that.
assuming,
All right.
let's say you play Pathfinder 2, you religiously follow exactly what I wrote in the victory point system section of the Game Master Guide or the GM Core to the letter. But you just happen not to have any fights. I think that you are still playing the game. Are you now? As I admitted earlier, and we said there are some issues with what you'll find over the course of a long campaign, where characters are just having way more in their bucket than others, where you could be playing other games that are even more focused on that, but you're still following the rules of the game. Whereas in Magic,
Right.
Magic,
They're
where
not
you're just
including-
destroying the lands, you're not
including
you're not
the marginal.
playing it.
You're not including the marginal utility of the fun they're not having. You gotta include
Like you're not, but it's different about fun and whether or not they're playing the game, right? Like to
Yes.
me, that would be similar. What they were doing is similar to if somebody was like, using the cards from like Monopoly's community chest and chance spaces to play code names with their Monopoly board, and then they thought they were playing Monopoly, which, to be clear,
Okay.
Monopoly is terrible and never fun, and Codenames is fun.
Okay.
So they probably have more fun than they would have if they actually played Monopoly. But I'm not sure how you can play Codenames with community chest. I just made that up. But the point is they weren't playing Monopoly, right?
Let's use a D&D example.
Okay.
Example. Okay. You're playing the game. You're not in a combat. There is a chasm. It's a fiery chasm. And your character leaps across the chasm in dramatic fashion. The GM does not call for an athletics check. Is that cheating in the context of what we were, or not playing by the rules in the context of what we were talking about with Magic the Gathering?
All right. Well, now we've gone into an interesting and different topic to what we were saying before, which is going back to the Brennan Lee Mulligan style of just kind of improvising and not using the rules there. I would say that if you leap across the 50-foot chasm, like you're...
No. 50 foot is obviously crazy and ridiculous. I'm also not talking about, a 1 foot, crack in the
What if it's a 10-foot leap?
Yeah, 10 foot.
What if it's a 10-foot leap with your elf with 30 feet of movement speed?
Yeah, 10
In
foot
Pathfinder, you don't call for a check. The rules say that you could just leap that.
Okay. Fine. 15 foot. I don't know the exact rules for Pathfinder as well as you do. So there you go.
Only if you're an elf with 30 feet. That's why I use that. If you were 25, you would there's a certain amount of distance you can go.
Okay, fine, Mark. There's a group of heroes, and the building is collapsing, and the chasms are opening up, and people are jumping across the thing, and a bunch of people all describe how their characters are leaping over the chasm, and the elf with 30-foot movement leaps across, no check, and then the human in armor leaps, no fleet, jumps across, and the GM says no check. Okay. Did they just violate the rules of the game?
They broke the rules, but that's okay. You don't have to follow all
Why
of them.
is that okay? but it wasn't okay when those people were playing Magic the
I
Gathering.
didn't say it wasn't okay. I just said they weren't playing Magic. They weren't, like, because of the fact that the rules of Pathfinder and D&D specifically say that the GM makes the call. Because
Which
Rule
is
0
such
is
a
in there.
bullshit rule.
Magic
Rule
does
0
not. Magic does not
Right.
have a rule that says that if you want to, you
By the way,
destroy all lands.
I wish people at home could see this. Mark, I don't know if you're in Discord. Can you pull up my profile, my Derik KOLC profile in Discord?
Let's do it. It says in a call.
Like, can you
Oh
see
yeah,
what my
it says members since, and then it says recent activity tabletop simulator.
does it not? It doesn't have my like. It doesn't have
Final
my, whatchamacallit.
Fantasy.
No, we got, like my motto, or like you can put like a little blurb in there, and it says in my Discord profile, it says Rule 0 is not an excuse to cheat. It literally says that in my Discord profile.
Fair enough.
D-Priest,
It
D-Priest just
doesn't
has it
show it to me, but maybe it's
Okay.
because I'm in streaming mode and some
May-
things aren't appearing in streaming mode.
It could be, but yeah. So D-Priest in chat, who is a member of my
The point is that, like, for those games, it specifically says that there's a judgment call for the GM of what to do, whereas in Magic, there is no such rule that says that you could just destroy all of your lands.
Right. Correct. That is true. However, I still feel like Rule 0 is the most bullshit thing of all time.
I think that Rule 0 is often abused as an excuse to allow for really outrageous statements. Be like, well, but Rule 0, so therefore I back up this outrageous statement. But that the existence of the idea that the GM is the GM's game, and the GM is doing a little bit of game design in the sense of trying to adjust things to be good for their group that wouldn't be good for every single player in the world to be into the full rules.
That's what those people were doing for Magic, I guess. But you're right. Magic doesn't say, the first rule of Magic doesn't say, hey, these are all the rules for Magic the Gathering. They're really important. That's why we're writing hundreds of pages of them. But also, these rules are useless and you can completely ignore them. I think that is craziness. I think, now don't get me wrong, there is a valid point to be made, and I think it is a good one to make, which is there is a role for the GM to say, hey, here is a situation that the rules do not cover. And there isn't anything that we can use in this situation. And it is my responsibility. And of course, because we're playing a role-playing game, there is an incentive for me to not just say, well, that's not in the rules, so you can't do it. So I am going to create or make a judgment. This is what we would call rulings over rules, right? That nomenclature. Fine. But the rulings over rules statement, I don't think is right. When people say rulings over rules, what they're really saying is rulings when there isn't a rule. And I think that, to me, makes a lot more sense than ruling over rules.
Some people just want a ruling. That also goes into the rule of cool thing.
Right,
I'm assuming that you also really don't like using rule of cool in games that have stated rules.
No, not even close. Because here's the thing: because people are such people are such cowards and they're such full of shit. Because for all the people out there who do the rule of cool, or they do the Rule 0, they do the thing, the moment combat starts, all that shit gets thrown out the window.
Some people do allow rule of cool in combat.
No, like, you described that so well. You're right. That your sword just instantly kills the monster. No one ever does that.
When they're using rule of cool, that doesn't mean rule of cool skips the die roll, to be clear. Rule of cool just sometimes allows a die roll that doesn't make any sense to me.
But think about
I'm defending it, and by the way, I am not
pro
rule of cool.
I know you're not.
But
I appreciate
a lot of the people who are pro rule of cool, though, would not say that just because you said something cool means you automatically succeed, but it would mean they'll give you a chance. So it's like the god kaiju that has destroyed 9,000 universes has just appeared before you. You're level 2, and you describe some really cool thing that sounded cool and like it might work, and because of rule of cool, the GM allows you to roll. And then it was a natural 20, and then he's like, all right, yeah, you killed the god kaiju at level 2. Like, That's
but I
more
think
of a thing that
no,
Rule
but
Cool
I
might
don't
do. It
think
wouldn't
that-
just be like, well, you automatically beat the God Kaiju
Yeah,
because it was
I don't think
cool.
that's how people use Rule of Cool, because I agree with Cinnabos, who says the Rule of Cool is stretched way too far. I don't think it is, hey, here's some crazy, here's some crazy situation, and the GM says, you know what, look, fuck it, it's D&D. You always have a 5% chance. I'm going to let you roll it. If you roll a 20, I'm going to say yes. You throw your spear, it goes over the battlefield, it passes through the double arrow slits, and it hits the necromancer right before he's about to complete his rite.
I think sometimes they allow it on an easier DC than natural 20, to be clear.
That's what I'm saying. I think a lot of people,
But they
with
still
Rule of
would
Cool-
ask for a roll. They wouldn't just say, oh, yeah, that sounded
Yeah,
cool that you were throwing your
no,
spear to hit the necromancer, so
I
you
think
automatically hit the necromancer.
I think it's a performative rule. I think it's one of those situations.
You think
where
it's
they're
like
gonna-
you with the Spock thing, where you were
Yes,
going to
yes.
ask for another roll afterwards anyway.
Correct, 100%. Right. Yeah. So I think that a lot of people go, okay, yeah. So Beowulf says, rule of cool in games I've been in has almost always been, that was cool idea. Roll a 20 and you do it. And you know what, Beowulf? I can actually respect that version of the rule of cool, where we go, look, we're playing D&D. It's a hyper accelerated version of reality where everybody has a 5% chance to do something completely ridiculous. And as long as there's even a slight physical possibility, like not I jump to the moon, but as long as there's even a slight remote physical possibility that you could do something, fine, fuck it. On a 20, you do it. But anyways, the point
It
I was
seems
trying
like
to
you
make,
have a very black and white feeling
Yes.
about Rule Zero, whereas strangely, you don't have that same feeling in other games that have different adjudications.
well, right,
like-
because in different games, the reason is because in different games there's like, especially like PBTA and Fortune Dark, there's a cost to rolling the dice. That's the difference. That's the key. There's a cost to rolling the dice. The cost to rolling the dice is that you might roll a 6- or a 1, 2, 3, and as a result, the GM is going to make a move. And so you're not getting it for free. And it's not even about punishing the players or challenging the players. God knows it's not about challenging the players. It's about creating real emotional moments. It's about putting stakes into this. It's about not having just completely worthless performative dice rolls, but dice rolls that actually matter, that are actually going to substantially change the outcomes of both the fictional state of our reality, our shared reality, and or the narrative outcome of whatever, story arc we're proceeding down.
Well, maybe
That
the
to me
GM
is
was
fun.
using Rule Zero to remove a pointless die roll. Like, let's say that you were jumping across a 15-foot gap. It existed, but it wasn't a chasm that leads down into a volcano. It was like 10 feet down, 8 feet down. You wouldn't have taken any falling damage. You just narrated, okay, well, sorry. Yeah, Bob, you made it over, but Kate, you look a little bit stupid because you fell into this pit 8 feet and you flumped onto your butt and you got back up and then you went across. And so there just wasn't enough narrative interest to it to be worth the die roll, unless maybe Kate's a character
to be
really
clear,
cares about how she looks.
Well, this is also why, generally speaking, over time, I have gotten away from and dislike what I will call simulationist resolution mechanics. And I think part of the problem
Doesn't that mean that you were rule zeroing by ignoring just saying, just don't roll it, you guys leap across the chasm?
Well, no. Because the only reason I would be asking for the roll across the chasm would be if there was a substantial enough penalty for it to matter. If it doesn't matter, then there's no dice roll.
Doesn't that mean you rule zeroed?
No, because
you rule zeroed because you just said if the GM chose not to call for a die roll when the fighter had extra armor.
Which game system?
We were talking about like Pathfinder or D&D.
Okay.
Right?
Oh, Pathfinder D&D. No, you make the die roll. And if you fail the dice roll, you fall into the chasm and die.
No, but what if the chasm was 8 feet deep and you wouldn't have taken any falling damage? You just would have had to get up your butt and go to the other side of it.
Yeah, I guess
you might skip it, right? Because there's no point.
Well, yeah, but
and you rule zero. You didn't roll the die roll.
No, that's not.
It was a pointless die roll that
that's
I think that nobody should ever roll. And I, to be clear, think that this is a perfect example of using Rule Zero to follow the spirit of what the game would want you to do. In fact, Pathfinder even specifically says in one place that, like, if you're climbing up a cliff, you shouldn't be rolling, like, 1,000 athletics checks to climb if you calculate that that's how many it would take to get to the top of the
Yes,
cliff.
correct.
But instead, you roll some much smaller number, perhaps even one, checks to determine like the overall quality of your climb with consequences so that you can fail forward.
There's a great we're playing Rise of the Rune Lords. This is years ago on my channel, and they are at the Misgivings. The goblin monk Mark decides to climb down the well. I don't know how familiar you are.
I am familiar with that well. It will easily backdoor you deep into the dungeon before you did a lot of the early stuff. And there's a ghoul bat nearby.
There is a ghoul bat. So the goblin monk is climbing down, and he's making athletics checks because that's what you do in Pathfinder 2. Keep in mind, this is like 2020. So, I mean, I hadn't played a ton of Pathfinder 2 yet. And he's making the checks, but of course, this is Pathfinder 2. So you only fall if you critically fail. If you fail the athletics check, you just don't make any progress. And it's impossible for him to critically fail unless he rolls a 1. But it is still possible for him to fail. And so theoretically, there is a 5% chance that he will fall and take a bunch of damage because it's a far enough fall, and there's a ghoul bat. So there is some real something at stake here. And he proceeds to make all these dice rolls, and it takes forever because he keeps failing but not falling. And this is during the game, and then while I was editing it, I have this like text that goes across the screen on my actual play where it says like, "Hey folks, it's Derik, the editor here. Rewatching this back, this is completely outrageous and ridiculous, and I don't really think anyone should actually follow these rules in this situation because this is terrible and horrifying."
It says you should just roll the 1 and fail them forward, possibly with some damage or something like that. Also, another neat trick you can do if you were like, no, I dogmatically must roll for each one. Let's say that he had a situation where he succeeded on a 10 and only critically failed on the natural 1, right? What you could do is roll a d12. Because of the fact that all of the numbers between 2 and 9 don't really actually exist. They just would require a reroll. Where the 1 being the critical failure, the 12 being a critical success, and the other numbers being a regular success. That will give you the exact same result as him rolling that d20 without, but skip all of the times that nothing happened.
There you go. I should have created a new dice mechanic on the fly in order to bypass.
I actually do that, but with also irregular random number generators for any side of dice when there's a situation where only critical failure or success matters on something. I calculate it, and then they'll be like, oh, so I critically fail on this number of pips. I succeed and critically succeed on this number, so we'll just do it like that.
But I do want to point out that the problem is that there's a symmetry there because that's the same way combat works, right? When you miss, you miss. You don't die. Your weapon doesn't explode. You just miss. You just did nothing. And the same thing's true for, in this example, the athletics check.
If you have a gun in the wrong system, your weapon might explode.
All right, fair enough. But the problem is that in combat there are meaningful stakes and different, and costs to failure. Whereas in most TTRPGs, especially if you're in some sort of other quote unquote pillar of play, I think is what they call it these days. Time isn't really much of a pressure, at least not on the scope and scale that most skill checks and most dice rolls take place over the course of.
Yes.
Most skill checks represent probably no more than a minute at most worth of time, which for most games is hand waveable. So, anyways, long story short, I think that the advantage of D&D is that it's, with combat is the skill system sucks. Most people ignore it anyways. There's no real stakes. The game tells you to ignore its rules anyways. And so what are we even doing here if we're not doing combat in D&D?
I mean, I think that most RPGs tell you to do that anyway, though. Not just D&D. Like, some of the games, other games we've been talking about here, even more so, tell you that you need to do your own thing with it. Like, that's part of Blades in the Dark's ethos, and one of the reasons it doesn't give as many examples of how to do certain decisions. Clear, it even says you need to come up with your own sort of tone and your own idiom for your game. and your group will naturally come up with one. It'll be different than anybody else's. How is that different than saying that there's a rule 0 to make things work for your group, to adjust things and to make rulings that may be in contradiction of this at times, but
Because it's
do it
different.
judiciously?
It's different to make a rule system, which is more of a framework for guiding GM decisions and outcomes, rather than making a hard rule system that is very explicit in what its outcomes are, and then telling the GM, but ignore them if you want. I do think there is a difference between the two of those. So,
Well, but at some level, some of the mechanics that are in the system are hard mechanics, even in a relatively soft system.
But
there are hard mechanics. It's not like in Blades in the Dark that if you roll a 2, you could just be like, well, actually, you succeeded with no consequences.
No, right? You cannot. In fact, actually, one of the things I love about Blades in the Dark, and I love about PBTA, is it doesn't let me cheat. I have to play by the rules too. Like, we could be in a situation where I, the GM, really want you to succeed, and you, as the player, really want you to succeed, and everyone at the table really wants you to succeed, but the game rules demand. In fact, the GM doesn't make a decision if a move triggers in PBTA. Anyone at the table should be able to, in fact, you're obligated to point out and say, wait a second, that move just triggered. We must roll the dice, and we must obey their outcome. We don't get a choice. The GM doesn't get to make a choice.
I think that's a very admirable thing about those games,
that.
by the way. I really appreciate that about those games. But I think that means that there is structure to it. It's not just a framework that you come up with anything that you want
but
for
the difference would be
there is actually some mandates.
Yeah, but the difference would be like, okay, if we were playing Avatar and your character, Mark, decided to, go against their deeply held beliefs. Okay. And according to the rules of the game, whenever, I'm just looking for one here. Whenever you lose your balance, you obsess over that principle to a degree that's not healthy for you. Choose one of the following: give in to your obsession, lose control of yourself in a destructive or harmful way, or take an extreme action in principle or in line with that principle and then flee. But as a GM, I go, well, rule 0, we're not going to do that this time because I don't think it's cool. That is cheating. In this game, that is cheating. You cannot do that. You must follow that rule. You don't get the discretion to avoid that rule. When you lose your balance in this game, you must pick one of those 3 things. And there's nothing in this game that tells you otherwise. I firmly stand by that.
I see what you're saying. And
whereas in D&D, if that was
because in D&D, rule 0 is at the very beginning and says that you can house roll or adjust or come up with any change that you want.
Right.
I think that maybe the reason why this is the case comes back to something that Jess likes to talk about sometimes on the show about D&D and Pathfinder being, because they're such big systems, even like an individual adventure path or big book for that can be like as weighty and genre-ish as like an entire game that is powered by the apocalypse or Forged in the Dark. And so in that sense, the fact that like a specific Forged in the Dark game, say, or Powered by the Apocalypse game might have some rules in there that are very, very hard line, but if you were to look at like the guidelines for writing a Forged in the Dark game, then in that case you would be able to make a lot of changes to the game system for your own Forged in the Dark game. But D&D and Pathfinder, to a degree, encourage their, especially D&D, encourage the players to be game designers who are making like their D&D. And it's obviously it's to D&D's advantage to encourage people to be like, oh no, don't go learn another game. Do some game design and change D&D until it's the exact game that you want to play. I'm not saying that this is done in an entirely altruistic model, but because it encourages people to do so, that's one of the reasons why Rule 0 is sort of like part of the system.
So a couple of things. Number one, there's a little bit of whataboutism in chat, which is, I want a couple of things. Number one, Rule 0 or Rule of Cool or whatever, as in my opinion, very different than a GM very deliberately, not in the heat of the moment, maybe after a discussion with their group, or maybe during session 0, or maybe after a session, going, hey, folks, in Avatar, when your characters get pushed past their principle, the rule says you have to give in or submit to your opposition, lose control of yourself, or take an extreme action and then flee. I don't like that last one, and I want to remove that bullet point. One of those. I want it to be these 2 options, not these 3 options.
That's for sure rule 0.
No,
that's one of the
no,
main ways that people rule 0.
That's not the way. That's different, Mark. That is Wriggler's talking about.
The game is your own. You can house rule if there's something that doesn't work for your group.
There's a difference between a house rule that you make in a very structured procedural way outside of the heat of the moment versus just on the fly in the moment deciding that now that this rule is applying, we don't want to follow the rule this time.
So I think that you are taking
I
think you are taking what you don't like about people making sort of like capricious or arbitrary rulings and kind of reading that into the kind of rule 0 definitions of that have been put into some of the games. To be clear, those definitions are fairly permissive, and I could see people who are trying to use them to do it your way.
My understanding of Rule 0 and Rule of Cool and the way that people are using it is flawed.
Oh no, I would call the thing that you just said more Rule of Cool than Rule 0. Rule of Cool is the one where you just do whatever because it sounded cool.
Like, for example, if we're playing the game and you go to jump across the fiery chasm so that you can go engage with the War Duke. And in the rules of the game, you should have to make an athletics check to jump across the chasm. And I just say, I hand wave it and I say, you jump across the chasm, because in my game, we don't make athletics checks to jump anymore. Okay, that's a little performative, but at least it's and it's a little ad hoc on the basis, but at least it's a defined ruling.
Right. If you say that you don't make athletics checks to jump, except for when there's some really weird thing, like let's say we were doing like a circus game and your jumps were very important, and otherwise we're just not gonna roll them.
Correct.
It's a weird ruling, but it's one that someone could make.
I agree. I personally would rather somebody make that decision, not in the moment, like maybe like before the game session or during session 0. Hey guys, I want to let you know, before you invest in athletics, I don't really call for athletics checks to like do cool parkour moves or like leap across a table or like jump across a ravine. If it's within your movement distance, it's totally fine. I don't call for that. That's not my style of game. I like it to be a little bit more swashbucklery, and I don't want to leave it up to that. And if you decide to make that change and you enact it, I don't think that's Rule 0. That's my personal belief. But again,
I think it is. And some people in chat seem to think so too, but I think not everyone agrees. It's interesting.
Yeah.
As someone who has been a co-author of a rule book that we don't literally have it called Rule 0, but we have a similar rule to that. I helped write that section. When I was writing it, the part that I was helping to write, I assumed it was more going to be used for thinking things through, making decisions for the best of the group, to alter the rules, and not for like just kind of like
ad hoc just bias, kind of fiat,
just capriciously not doing anything remotely similar to it at any given moment. But I'm not saying that people can't do it that other way, but that's not something that I would necessarily recommend, not because it can't wind up being a balanced game, but because players want a sense of fairness and understanding what the heck is going on. And if they're playing a game like Pathfinder 2, which is the one that I worked on writing, so that I'm talking about right now, then I think you're doing a disservice if it's so capricious that they can't guess. Like, imagine it wasn't even just whether you roll or not for the check, but that you just kept changing the DC.
Well,
and so the person who had a plus 10 and last time you said it was DC 12 rolls, and you're like, well, sorry, it was DC 32, and you failed, and you would have failed on any die roll, and you fall and die. Like, if you start changing the ruling just kind of randomly and without that reasoned approach where you're trying to talk to people, or you do it for like with a specific explanation, it just literally, in this case, because it's falling, takes the ground out from under people, and they can't predict what they can do.
Yeah, I view Rule 0 as being more like, for me, and the way that I view in fact, the reason why I think we need a GM is because despite how long the rules are, they do not cover every situation. and the GM has to make a decision occasionally in order to cover a situation which isn't covered by the rules. If a situation is covered by the rules, then I expect for those rules to be followed. Now, if the GM decides that for their game they don't want that rule, even though it exists, to be in effect, that's a fine decision to make too. I would prefer that they made it, again, not spur of the moment. But if they do decide to make it spur of the moment, I would expect that to be true for all future situations like that going forward. My problem with these things is a lot of times they feed into a GM bias. They feed into an attempt to sort of show favoritism or show a preference to a certain outcome. And that's the way I see them, in my opinion, get used a lot, where a GM will call for perception checks. But then when there's something that the GM, quote unquote, needs the party to find, he'll just say, no perception check, you find it. That's where that's to me, that feels very like, what are we even doing here? Because now it's not about rule of cool. It's not about making a ruling. It's not about changing the house rule. It's about this like gaslighting performative dice roll. I don't know what it is. It's terrible and I don't like it. But I don't know how this is about combat. But I guess
Well, there was a question, a super chat in chat that was asking what's the difference between playing a campaign without combat and playing a pacifist. I think the difference is if you're playing a pacifist, there may be combat, but your character has chosen not to engage in it. Correct.
That would be, hey, there's a fight happening, and you're like, I go and but even, I mean, look at Hacksaw Ridge. You could be a pacifist and still be a cleric, And in fact, if you played Pathfinder 2, a lot of people will tell you that the only thing you do as a cleric in Pathfinder 2 is cast heal or treat wound. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean...
And if you're playing 3rd edition and you just took the vow of peace and the vow of poverty or whatever, now you're a super powerful broken character.
So, as game master, you have the final say on how the world and rules function and how non-player characters act. This rule's purpose is to make the game run smoothly, with one guiding hand ensuring consistency. It's not intended to make one player into a dictator over the rest of the group. Collaboration is vital to role-playing games.
I think...
What do you think about that? About what I just read to you?
I mean, yes, I think that's better than just carte blanche. You can do whatever you want.
This is literally the Pathfinder 2 version of
Pathfinder 2. I'm sure the
Pathfinder... It even explains what the purpose was. And it said surprises. It said that the purpose was not to capriciously just do whatever, but to ensure consistency. Consistency is in the rule. It's Pathfinder mentioned there. 2, the one that I and some other people in chat who said I'm with Mark on this one were saying.
No shocker. Pathfinder 2's is better. I mean, again, if it's about
whereas D&D 5e was more like the rules are not in charge, you're in charge.
Right. Improving consistency, if that is a stated goal of your game, then I'm okay with that, as long as it's consistent and we make things consistent. However, I do think it leads to situations, whether consciously or unconsciously, I think it leads to situations that involve bias and a dilution of the game's, core. I don't know, the whole point of the rules and the whole point of the system. Because as you were saying that, I realized something, which might be, I think it puts me in a very different category than I think a lot of other GMs, including GMs in this chat. It goes back to my enjoyment of Powered by the Apocalypse, where there are rules that say when the players do this, when a PC does this, this rule, this move must trigger. In fact, it does trigger. In fact, if the GM doesn't call for the move, another player is supposed to step up and go, hey guys, I think her action there should have triggered this move. And everyone's supposed to go, oh yeah, definitely. I don't get to make a decision like, oh no, it doesn't apply that time. I'm the one who makes that decision. No, the game does. But it goes back even to old school D&D. I like reaction rolls. I like morale checks. You know why? I like not being in charge. I like that separation for me as the GM. I like to be as much of an audience member as I am a director, I guess. And I like to, as John Harper says, right, to disclaim decision-making. I enjoy that process of disclaiming decision-making.
It wasn't me, it was the die.
It wasn't me, it was the dice. But not only that, it means I get to be invested, too, in being surprised or delighted in the outcome. And having a comprehensive rule set, which we all agree to follow, is a great way for me to, one, avoid bias, two, make sure that my players are also making, agency-filled decisions, because they get to decide what to do, and they know what they do, how it works. But more important than that, three, it means that I don't have to put, I can disclaim decision making. This is what the rules say, and we agree to follow the rules, so that's fine. If we do have a problem with that, we can change those later. But at this point in time, I'd rather kind of just be like, yeah, hey, look, guys, I wanted the monster to stay and fight, but it failed its morale check, and you know what? I'm going to respect that. And the last thing I want to say before I go is people who are like talking about this kind of whataboutism about Gary Gygax. Number one, I don't think we should. Gary Gygax, respect should be put on his name. He created the hobby. But also, too, realize that for all the people talking about how Gary Gygax is talking about rolling the game, Gary Gygax also is on record as saying things like, you should fudge to kill a player character just to show them sometimes who's boss. So don't hold Gary Gygax up to too high of a light, because Gary Gygax, in his he just kind of rules the cools. He also encouraged and in fact, like if he thought a player had maybe read a monster's entry in the monster manual, he would like kill that player's character as a deliberate, act of retribution against that character for violating the tenets of the law of the land. So yeah, don't hold Gary Gygax up to too much of as an example of, well, Gary Gygax fudged. Yeah, he did by capriciously murdering player characters who had somehow offended him.
As it turns out, being the person who is a pioneer who creates something does not necessarily mean that they are someone who is like the top luminary who you should listen to about that thing. I say this as one of the creators of Pathfinder. That doesn't mean you have to listen to me about it. There may be people out there who are doing things that are more exciting with their campaigns than even I am. And I think that's wonderful, actually. I think it's sad for if you had a game system where only the creator can truly see the depths of it, and it will never grow, evolve, and become something greater than what they could have imagined.
Right. And again, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff. And again, I think he took, he was definitely Cranky Smurf says it was his table, different than ours. And, I agree with Wriggler that it was very much an us versus them. And, it was a product of his time and all that other jazz as well. But, I think Dave Arneson, generally speaking, was a little bit cooler. So I agree with Real Neutromancer there. But yeah, I think that at the end of the day, I think the reason that combat tends to be enjoyed and why people play D&D with combat is because it's the part of the game that typically involves the least amount of rule zero and GM bullshit. We all kind of meet on relatively even ground. We know what's at stake. We all get a turn. It's the most board gamey. It's the most procedural. It's the one where the rules kind of have the most teeth. I think a lot of players and GMs, but players too, are more accepting of DM hand wavium outside of combat. But I think when you get people that are upset, it's when there's DM hand wavium in combat. There's a lot of
it depends on the players, but that you're right. There are a subset that are exactly as you say. But there's some people who actually like the random rule of cool, capricious stuff, and they actually have more problems with combat. I've seen it. They're usually probably a better fit for a different role-playing game, but they're the person who will try to do like 3 to 4 turns worth of stuff during their turn every time.
Sure.
When they get their turn in combat, and they get really annoyed when you stop them once they've done a full turn's worth of stuff. Or once you tell them that the point that they would have to stop after they've done a full turn is not nearly having completed the thing they want to do, and it would be pretty awkward for them to have to stop at that middle point. Like, there are people who are like that.
Yeah, selfish asshole players aside. The combat
I don't think they were all assholes, to be fair. As someone who I myself am obviously not that way, and I don't always appreciate playing with them. I don't think they were trying to be an asshole. I think they're trying to be fun and exciting and do something cool. And I've played with GMs who allowed the players to do 3 turns worth of stuff. And I actually got annoyed because I wasn't doing 3 turns worth of stuff. Right. I was following the rules, and my character was just like bad because I was following the rules.
Yeah, it turns out when other people have triple your action economy, they're a little bit more productive than you. But well, because what I was going to say is, one of the reasons I enjoy Forged in the Dark games and Powered by the Apocalypse games is because I feel like me and the players are on more of an even footing. And I feel more like I'm a player, they're players. We just have different roles. And I like that feeling of equality. I don't want to be this superior Lord, Master, God of the universe. I want to be part of the group. And I think in some ways, combat is the great equalizer. Yes, there are DMs who fudge. We know this. But I think that for the most part, for most groups, combat is the one place where everybody kind of agrees that we're going to basically mostly follow the rules, again, in general. And everyone kind of understands how things work, and you're not going to get like too surprised. I think outside of combat, you might go to talk to some NPC. Maybe the GM says, "Oh, they agree to your request," or maybe they ask you to make a diplomacy check, or maybe that they require you to list the person's favorite color and what's the average airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow or whatever.
African or European?
I don't know that. But you don't know what you're getting. But in combat, you go, I know I'm gonna roll the die. If it hits their AC, I'm gonna do damage to them. When the hit points go to 0, they're dead. And like I think there's a lot of enjoyment in that kind of certainty and that kind of that level of expectation as well. So
all right. All right. There you have it, folks. We answered right at the beginning that can you run it? You probably can. Should you run it? You probably shouldn't unless you're one of a few different situations where you might. And we've had a long and I think fruitful discussion about the hows and whys and some in-depth game design insights. But Derik now has to go to racquetball.
Right.
Often lose racquetball.
I am the monsters. You're
the monsters who have a more than 90% chance to lose.
Of losing.
Maybe as a GM, that is also what makes you so interested in playing this racquetball thing, because it reminds you of GMing.
I will say that we played Monday, and we only played 2 games because they were long games, and we were kind of coming back from the holidays. And
did you TPK him?
No, I won 1, I lost 1. So right now I am 1-1 on the year, and so I there was a part of me that wanted to retire with that record.
Dominguez Priest says you need a GM to fudge for you.
Right,
there.
Exactly. I really do. I really do. To be clear, I would not be playing racquetball if every time I lost I was dead. So there is that.
That is a really good point. You probably wouldn't play anymore either if every time it looked like you were losing, the other guy just like whiffed on purpose so that you would suddenly win.
I would also not be interested in playing. So there you go. That's a good point. All right. Everybody.
Well, take care, everyone, and we will see you next week on Roll for Combat. Until next time, if you want to battle the zoo or get this weird for $1, $90 book that keeps being advertised by the bot on here, you have to roll for combat. It is crazy.
You should get it. Plus, it's got Squirrel Ash on the cover.
You should get it. Even my dad, who refuses to get any of our PDF things, is going to do that one because there is a hardcover that is the $1 incentive. Bye, everyone.